The gavel trembled in auctioneer Morrison's weathered hand as he stared at the figure on the platform. A burlap sack covered her head completely, tied with rough rope around her neck, leaving only her trembling hands visible as they clutched the fabric of her torn dress. The crowd of men in Millbrook Falls had fallen silent, a rarity for any auction, let alone one selling human souls to pay debts. What am I bid for this? Woman. Morrison's voice cracked. Even he seemed disgusted by the spectacle. Thomas Blackwood stood at the back of the crowd, his massive frame casting a shadow over the smaller men. At 32, he was known throughout the lumber camps as a man who could fell a tree with fewer swings than any other, but also as someone who kept to himself in his cabin on Cedar Ridge. His calloused hands clenched into fists as he watched the degrading scene unfold. $5, someone shouted. Cruel laughter rippled through the crowd. Do I hear 10? Morrison called half-heartedly. Thomas had seen enough. He'd come to town for supplies, not to witness this medieval horror. As he turned to leave, the woman's head tilted slightly in his direction, and even through the sack, he could sense her desperation. Something in his chest tightened, a recognition of loneliness that he knew too well. $20, Thomas called out, his deep voice cutting through the crowd like an axe through wood. The crowd turned to stare at the giant lumberjack. Men whispered among themselves, wondering why Thomas Blackwood would waste $20 on damaged goods. But Thomas wasn't thinking about money. He was thinking about the trembling hands, the way she'd turned toward his voice, as if it were a lifeline. Going once, going twice, ... Morrison looked around hopefully, but no one challenged the intimidating woodsman. Sold to Thomas Blackwood for $20. As Thomas pushed through the crowd toward the platform, he heard the whispers. What's he gonna do with her? Poor bastard doesn't know what he's getting into. Probably can't even speak proper English. Thomas climbed onto the platform and reached into his leather pouch, counting out the bills. The woman stood perfectly still, her breathing shallow and rapid through the burlap. When he held out his hand to help her down, she flinched. It's all right, he said softly, his voice gentle despite its rumbling depth. I'm not going to hurt you. She hesitated, then slowly reached for his hand. Her fingers were ice-cold and trembling. As he helped her down from the platform, he noticed how small. She was barely reaching his chest down, as if every step caused pain. Come on, he said, leading her through the crowd that parted before them. Let's get you out of here. As they walked toward his wagon, Thomas wondered what he'd just done. He'd acted on instinct, unable to stand by while another human being was degraded. But now, walking beside this mysterious woman with a sack over her head, he realized his lonely life was about to change forever. Behind them, the crowd dispersed, already moving on to the next spectacle. But Thomas Blackwood had just made the most important purchase of his life, though he wouldn't understand the true value of his $20 until she spoke her name. The wagon wheels creaked rhythmically as Thomas guided his horses along the winding mountain path toward Cedar Ridge. The woman sat beside him in complete silence, her hands folded in her lap, the burlap sack still covering her head like a grotesque hood. Thomas had offered to remove it twice during the first mile, but she'd shaken her head vigorously both times. Are you hungry? He asked as they passed a small creek. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I have some bread and cheese in the back. She shook her head again, but Thomas noticed how her hands moved to her stomach. She was clearly starving, but too afraid or proud to accept food from a stranger who'd just bought her like livestock. Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop beside the creek. We'll rest here for a bit, he announced, climbing down and offering his hand. This time, she took it without hesitation, though she still moved carefully, as if her body ached. While she sat on a fallen log by the water's edge, Thomas unpacked food from his supplies. He set out bread, cheese, dried meat, and a jar of his neighbor's honey. Then, he walked upstream to give her privacy, settling on a boulder to eat his own meal. After several minutes, he heard the soft tearing of bread. When he looked back, he saw her lifting the bottom of the sack just enough to slip food underneath. The sight made his heart ache. What kind of hell had this woman endured that she couldn't even show her face to the man who'd rescued her? My name is Thomas, he called out, hoping conversation might help her relax. Thomas Blackwood. I live about an hour's ride from here, up on Cedar Ridge. It's quiet, peaceful. You'll be safe there. She stopped eating, her head turned toward him, and for a moment, he thought she might speak. Instead, she simply nodded. As darkness began to fall, Thomas noticed her shivering. He pulled a heavy wool blanket from his supplies and approached slowly. Here, he said, draping it around her shoulders. Mountain nights get cold. For the first time, she looked up at him. Even through the burlap, he could see the outline of her face, the way she was studying him. There was intelligence in her posture, a cautious assessment of his intentions. "I know you don't know me," Thomas continued, settling back on his boulder. "I know you have no reason to trust me. But I want you to know that I didn't buy you as a possession. I bought you to get you away from those men. What happens next is up to you." The woman's head tilted slightly. She seemed to be considering his words. "I have a spare room in my cabin," Thomas explained. "It's not much, but it's warm and dry. You can stay as long as you need, or until you figure out where you want to go. I won't ask anything of you, and I won't touch you unless you want me to." A soft sound escaped from beneath the sack, not quite a sob, but close. Her shoulders shook slightly, and Thomas realized she was crying. "Hey," he said gently, rising from his boulder. "It's going to be all right. Whatever happened before, it's over now." She nodded, wiping at her eyes through the burlap. When she looked up at him again, Thomas saw something different in her posture, a tiny spark of hope. They finished the journey in comfortable silence. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the woman seemed to relax slightly. She sat straighter, her hands not quite so tightly clenched. When they finally reached Thomas's cabin, a sturdy log structure with a stone chimney and flower boxes that he'd built himself, she actually gasped. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Thomas nearly dropped the reins. Her voice was soft, melodic, with a slight accent he couldn't place. It was the first time she'd spoken, and the sound sent an unexpected warmth through his chest. "Thank you," he said, helping her down from the wagon. "Welcome home." The word home seemed to echo in the mountain air, full of promise and possibility. Thomas's cabin was everything the woman hadn't dared to hope for. As he lit the oil lamps, warm light revealed hand-hewn furniture, colorful quilts, and shelves lined with books. The main room featured a stone fireplace with a thick bearskin rug, and through an open doorway, she could see a tidy kitchen with copper pots hanging from hooks. "The spare room is through here," Thomas said, leading her to a small chamber off the main room. Inside was a single bed with a patchwork quilt, a wooden chest, and a window that looked out over the valley. "There's a wash basin and pitcher, and I'll bring you some clean clothes." She stood in the doorway, still wearing the burlap sack, taking in the simple but comfortable space. It was more luxury than she'd seen in years. "I'll leave you to get settled," Thomas said, backing toward the door. "I'll be right outside if you need anything." "Wait," she said softly. Thomas turned back, his gentle brown eyes questioning. "Why did you help me?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. "I know what it's like to be alone," he finally said. "To feel like the world has forgotten you exist. I couldn't let you face that kind of loneliness when I had the power to help." After he left, closing the door behind him, she sat on the bed and touched the soft quilt. Her fingers, still trembling slightly, traced the intricate stitching. When had she last felt anything so clean and warm? She could hear Thomas moving around in the main room, stoking the fire and preparing what smelled like soup. The domestic sounds were foreign to her. It had been so long since she'd experienced anything resembling normal life. Slowly, she reached up and began to untie the rope around her neck. The burlap fell away, revealing a face that was both beautiful and haunted. Her dark hair was matted and dirty, her olive skin marked with fading bruises, but her eyes, deep green and intelligent, held a spark of defiance that years of abuse hadn't been able to extinguish. In the wash basin, she found soap and clean water. As she washed her face and hands, she caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the basin. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. When had she become so thin? When had her eyes grown so wary? A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "I left some clothes by the door," Thomas called, "and there's soup when you're ready." She opened the door a crack and retrieved the bundle, a simple brown dress, clean undergarments, and thick wool socks. Everything was too large for her small frame, but it was the finest clothing she'd worn in years. When she emerged from the room 20 minutes later, Thomas was stirring a pot over the fire. He looked up as she entered, and his eyes widened slightly. Without the sack, she was lovely, not in a conventional way, but with an unusual beauty that spoke of strength and intelligence. "You look ... better," he said, then immediately flushed. "I mean, more comfortable." She almost smiled. "Thank you for everything." Thomas ladled soup into 2 bowls and gestured toward the table. "It's just rabbit stew," he said. "Nothing fancy." They ate in comfortable silence, but Thomas noticed how she savored each bite, how her eyes closed in pleasure at the taste of real food. When she finished, she sat back and looked around the cabin again. "How long have you lived here?" she asked. "About 5 years," Thomas replied. "Built it myself after I left the lumber camps. I still cut timber, but now I work for myself. It's peaceful, she said. I can see why you chose this place. What about you? Thomas asked gently. Where are you from? Her face shuddered slightly. Far away, she said. Very far away. Thomas nodded, understanding that some stories couldn't be told all at once. Well, you're safe here. That's what matters. As the evening wore on, they talked about small things. The weather, the mountains, the books on his shelves. Thomas learned that she was well educated, that she knew several languages, and that she had a quick wit that occasionally broke through her wariness. When she finally retired to her room, Thomas sat by the fire and wondered what tomorrow would bring. For the first time in years, his cabin didn't feel empty. It felt like a home. 3 weeks passed in a gentle routine that surprised them both. Each morning, Thomas would wake before dawn to tend his horses and check his traps, leaving fresh water and breakfast outside her door. By the time he returned, she would have the cabin tidied and often a simple meal prepared. They were like two careful dancers, orbiting each other with respect and growing familiarity. She still hadn't told him her name. You don't have to tell me anything until you're ready, Thomas had said after the first week, when she'd grown frustrated with his careful questions. I just want to know what to call you. Call me Anna, she'd said, though something in her eyes suggested it wasn't her real name. Thomas accepted this, just as he accepted her nightmares that sometimes woke him from across the cabin. But there were breakthrough moments too. The morning he found her laughing at a squirrel that had gotten into their food stores. Her face lit up with genuine joy. The evening she'd shyly asked if she could read one of his books, then spent the night curled by the fire with a volume of poetry, occasionally reading passages aloud in her melodic voice. Listen to this, she'd said one night, her finger tracing the words. He writes, the woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep. It's beautiful, isn't it? The way he captures both the longing for peace and the duty to keep living. Thomas had watched her face in the firelight, seeing depths of understanding that spoke of her own struggles with longing and duty. You have good taste in poetry, he'd said. My father used to read to me, she'd replied, then immediately looked stricken, as if the memory had escaped without permission. Thomas had simply nodded and added another log to the fire, understanding that her past was full of landmines that could explode without warning. As autumn deepened, their conversations grew longer and more personal. Thomas told her about his childhood in the lumber camps, about the father who died in a logging accident when Thomas was 16, about the loneliness that had driven him to the mountains. I used to think I was meant to be alone, he said one evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset, that maybe some people are just built for solitude. And now? Anna asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas looked at her, noting how the evening light caught the red highlights in her dark hair, how her green eyes had grown less haunted over the week. Now I think maybe I was just waiting for the right person to share the solitude with. Anna's breath caught. She turned to study his face, seeing only honesty and growing affection. Thomas, she said carefully, what do you think you know about me? I know you're educated and intelligent, he said. I know you've been hurt badly, but you're not broken. I know you're brave, braver than you give yourself credit for. I know you make terrible coffee but excellent bread. I know you sing when you think I can't hear you, and you have the most beautiful voice I've ever heard. Anna's eyes filled with tears. You don't know anything about my past, about what I've done, about what was done to me. I know enough, Thomas said firmly. I know that you're kind to injured animals, that you've mended every torn piece of clothing I own, that you leave wildflowers on my mother's grave, even though you've never met her. I know that whatever happened before doesn't change who you are now. But what if it does? Anna whispered. What if I'm not who you think I am? Thomas reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, he took her hand in his large, calloused one. Then I'll learn to love who you really are, he said simply. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and promise. Anna stared at their joined hands, feeling something she'd thought was dead inside her beginning to stir back to life. That night, she dreamed not of the past, but of the future. October brought the first snow to Cedar Ridge, blanketing the mountains in pristine white. Anna stood at the kitchen window, watching Thomas split wood in the yard, his powerful frame moving with practiced efficiency. The domestic scene filled her with a contentment she'd never thought possible, but also with a growing dread. She was falling in love with him, despite every wall she'd built around her heart, despite every reason she had to remain guarded. Thomas Blackwood was slipping past her defenses with his gentle strength and unwavering kindness. The realization terrified her more than any physical threat ever had. You're going to wear a hole in that window? Thomas said, stamping snow off his boots as he entered the kitchen. His cheeks were red from the cold, and his breath steamed in the warm air. I was just watching the snow, Anna said, moving away from the window. It's beautiful. First snow of the season. Thomas agreed, hanging his coat on a peg by the door. We'll be snowed in soon. I hope you don't mind being stuck with just me for company. Anna's heart clenched. Being snowed in with Thomas sounded like paradise. But she knew she couldn't continue this charade much longer. Every day of happiness felt stolen, built on lies, and Thomas, she said carefully, what would you do if you discovered that someone you cared about had been dishonest with you? Thomas paused in washing his hands at the basin. Depends on the kind of dishonesty, he said. If they lied about something important because they were scared or trying to protect themselves, I'd try to understand. If they lied to hurt someone or for personal gain, that would be different. Anna nodded, filing away his response. That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, she found herself studying his face in the flickering light. He was reading, his brow furrowed in concentration, occasionally making soft sounds of interest or amusement. She'd memorized every line of his face, every expression, every gesture. Thomas, she said suddenly, I need to tell you something. He looked up from his book, immediately alert to the seriousness in her tone. What is it? Anna took a deep breath. My name isn't Anna. Thomas closed his book and set it aside. What is your name? Isabella, she said. Isabella Rossetti. The name hung between them like a bridge she was terrified to cross. Thomas's expression didn't change, but she saw him processing the information, the foreign sound of it. Isabella, he repeated, as if testing how it felt on his tongue. It's a beautiful name. Why didn't you tell me before? Because Isabella Rossetti is wanted by some very dangerous people, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. People who would kill anyone who helped her. Thomas leaned forward, his brown eyes intense. Tell me. And so she did. The words poured out of her like water from a broken dam. The story of her father, a professor of languages who'd fled Italy with his young daughter after witnessing a murder committed by powerful men. Their years of hiding, moving from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough to form real connections. Her father's death from pneumonia when she was 22, leaving her alone and vulnerable. I tried to make it on my own, Isabella continued, her hands twisted in her lap. I worked as a translator, always moving, always careful. But they found me in Chicago. They said I knew too much, that my father had seen too much. They said I could work for them or die. Thomas's jaw tightened. What kind of work? Translating documents. Messages. Weren't legal. Isabella's voice broke slightly. I tried to refuse, but they made it clear that wasn't an option. They kept me locked up, brought me papers to translate. When I tried to escape, she touched her cheek, where a faint scar was barely visible. They made sure I understood the consequences of disobedience. How did you end up at the auction? Thomas asked, his voice carefully controlled. I managed to escape during a transfer between safe houses. I hid in freight trains, walked through forests, stole food to survive. I made it almost to the Canadian border before they caught me again. Isabella's voice grew hollow. They said I was too much trouble to keep, but too dangerous to release. The auction was their way of getting rid of me while making a profit. Thomas was silent for a long moment, processing everything she'd told him. Isabella watched his face anxiously, waiting for the moment when he would realize the danger she'd brought to his peaceful life. Isabella, he said finally, look at me. She raised her eyes to his, expecting to see fear or anger. Instead, she saw only the same gentle affection she'd grown to cherish. Thank you for trusting me with the truth, he said. I know it wasn't easy. You don't understand, Isabella said desperately. These people, they don't give up. They'll keep looking for me. If they find me here, they'll kill you too. Thomas stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. How long has it been since you escaped? 3 months, and they haven't found you yet. Thomas turned back to her. Maybe they've given up. Maybe they think you're dead. They don't give up, Isabella insisted. They can't afford to. I know too much about their operation. Thomas returned to his chair and leaned forward, taking her hands in his. Isabella, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going to turn you away, and I'm not going to let anyone hurt you. Do you understand? Isabella stared at him, tears streaming down her face. Why? She whispered. Why would you risk everything for me? Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. Because I love you, he said simply. I love your courage, your intelligence, your strength. I love the way you sing when you think. I can't hear. The way you leave flowers on my mother's grave. The way you've brought light into my dark world. I love you, Isabella Rossetti, and I'm not letting you go." The words broke something open inside her, something that had been frozen for years. Isabella threw herself into his arms, sobbing against his chest as he held her close. "I love you too," she whispered. "I love you so much it terrifies me." Outside, the snow continued to fall, sealing them into their mountain sanctuary. But for the first time in years, Isabella felt truly safe. Winter deepened around Cedar Ridge, transforming the landscape into a crystalline wonderland that seemed to exist outside of time. For 3 months, Isabella and Thomas lived in peaceful isolation, their love growing stronger with each passing day. The outside world felt like a distant memory, a bad dream from which Isabella had finally awakened. They fell into a rhythm of domestic bliss that surprised them both. Thomas taught Isabella to snowshoe and ice fish, while she taught him Italian phrases and helped him improve his reading. Their evenings were spent by the fire, sharing stories, dreams, and quiet intimacies that bound them closer together. "Tell me about your father," Thomas said one evening in February, as they sat wrapped in blankets on the porch, watching the northern lights dance across the sky. Isabella smiled, the painful memories soft by time and love. "He was a dreamer," she said, "always lost in his books, speaking to me in different languages depending on his mood. Italian when he was happy, French when he was thoughtful, English when he was worried. He used to say that every language was a different way of seeing the world. What would he think of me?" Thomas asked. Isabella considered the question seriously. "He would love you," she said finally. "He would appreciate your honesty, your strength. He would be grateful that you make me laugh." She paused. "He would be proud that I found someone who sees me as more than just a burden to be hidden." Thomas turned to study her face in the starlight. "You're not a burden, Isabella. You're a gift, the best thing that's ever happened to me." As spring approached, bringing the promise of melting snow and the return of the outside world, Thomas found himself thinking more and more about the future. He wanted Isabella to be his wife, to make their love official in the eyes of God and man. But he also knew that marriage would mean more than just a ceremony. It would mean legally binding their lives together, which could put Isabella in danger if her past ever caught up with them. One March morning, as Isabella worked in the kitchen making bread, Thomas sat whittling at the table, his hands shaping something small and delicate from a piece of birch wood. Isabella glanced over curiously several times, but Thomas always angled his work away from her view. She asked finally. "A surprise?" Thomas said, his eyes twinkling. "You'll see soon enough." That evening, after dinner, Thomas led Isabella out to the porch where they'd shared so many conversations. The spring air was crisp but warming, and the first brave crocuses were beginning to push through the melting snow. "Isabella," Thomas said, turning to face her, "I have something to ask you." She looked up at him, noting the nervous energy in his posture. "What is it?" Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out what he'd been carving, a simple wooden ring, perfectly sized for a finger, with tiny flowers carved around the band. "I know I can't give you a fancy gold ring or a big wedding," he said, dropping to one knee. "I know that marrying me might complicate your life in ways we can't predict. But I love you, Isabella Rossetti, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" Isabella stared at the ring, tears streaming down her face. The simple wooden band was more beautiful to her than any diamond could have been, because it was made by Thomas's hands, shaped by his love for her. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood and swept her into his arms, spinning her around the porch as she laughed with pure joy. When he set her down, they were both crying and laughing at the same time. Isabella asked, admiring the ring on her finger. "As soon as we can get to town," Thomas said. "I want you to be my wife, Isabella. I want the whole world to know that you belong with me." Isabella's smile faltered slightly. "Thomas, are you sure? Once we're married, your life will be tied to mine. If they find me, they won't," Thomas said firmly. "And even if they do, we'll face it together, as husband and wife." The next morning, they began preparations for their trip to Millbrook Falls. Thomas cleaned and oiled his rifle, checked his supplies, and made sure the wagon was in good repair. Isabella tried on the one good dress she owned, a simple blue garment that Thomas had bought for her in the fall. "I don't look like much of a bride," she said, studying herself in the mirror. Thomas came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You look perfect," he said, kissing the top of her head. "You look like the woman I love." As they prepared to leave their mountain sanctuary, both Thomas and Isabella felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. They were taking the first step toward a new life together, but they were also returning to a world that held dangers they couldn't predict. "Are you ready?" Thomas asked, helping Isabella into the wagon. Isabella looked back at the cabin that had been their refuge, then at the ring on her finger, then at the man who had transformed her life with his love. "I'm ready," she said, taking his hand. "Let's go get married." As they rode down the mountain path, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the tree line, or the way he smiled coldly before melting back into the forest. The town of Millbrook Falls had changed little since the autumn auction that had brought Isabella into Thomas's life. The same weathered buildings lined Main Street, the same mix of loggers, farmers, and merchants going about their daily business. But as Thomas and Isabella rode into town, Isabella felt as though she was seeing it through different eyes, no longer as a place of degradation and fear, but as the beginning of her new life. Pastor Williams, a kind man in his 60s who had known Thomas since childhood, greeted them warmly at the small white church. "Thomas, my boy, I haven't seen you in months, and this must be the young lady I've heard about." "This is Isabella," Thomas said, his arm protectively around her waist. "We'd like to be married." Pastor Williams smiled, noting the obvious love between them. "I'd be honored to perform the ceremony. Do you have witnesses?" Thomas nodded toward the door, where his neighbors, the Hartmans, were just arriving. Jacob Hartman was a fellow logger who lived in the valley below Cedar Ridge, and his wife Maria was one of the few people who had ever managed to visit Thomas's cabin. "We wouldn't miss it," Maria said, embracing Isabella warmly. "Thomas has been like a brother to Jacob. We're so happy he found someone to share his life with." The ceremony was simple but beautiful. Isabella wore her blue dress with a crown of wildflowers that Maria had quickly woven for her. Thomas stood tall and proud in his best clothes, his eyes never leaving Isabella's face as they exchanged vows. "Do you, Thomas Blackwood, take Isabella to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part?" "I do," Thomas said, his voice strong and clear. "Do you, Isabella Rossetti, take Thomas to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part?" Isabella looked into Thomas's eyes, seeing in them the promise of safety, love, and a future she had never dared to dream possible. "I do," she said. "By the power vested in me by the state of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Thomas, you may kiss your bride." Thomas cupped Isabella's face in his hands and kissed her gently, sealing their union with all the love and tenderness he felt for her. The small congregation applauded, and Maria wiped tears from her eyes. After signing the marriage certificate, the group retired to the town's only hotel for a modest celebration. Jacob had arranged for a special dinner, and the hotel owner, impressed by Thomas's reputation as an honest man, had decorated the dining room with candles and flowers. To Thomas and Isabella, Jacob raised his glass. "May your love grow stronger with each passing year." As they ate and talked, Isabella felt a happiness she had never experienced before. For the first time in her life, she felt like she truly belonged somewhere, with someone who loved her, not despite her past, but because of the strength it had given her. "I have something for you," Thomas said quietly, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small, wrapped package. "I wanted to wait until we were officially married." Isabella opened the package to find a delicate gold locket, obviously old but well. Inside was a photograph of a woman who looked remarkably like Thomas. "It was my mother's," Thomas explained. "She died when I was young, but I always hoped that someday I'd find someone worthy of wearing it, someone who would understand the love that went into it." Isabella's eyes filled with tears as Thomas fastened the locket around her neck. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll treasure it always." As the evening wound down, the newlyweds prepared to return to their cabin. They were loading supplies into their wagon when a stranger approached a well-dressed man in a dark coat who seemed out of place in the rough mountain town. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice carrying a slight accent. "I'm looking for someone who might have passed through here recently." A young woman, dark hair, green eyes. She would have been ... in distress. Thomas felt Isabella tense beside him. He stepped slightly in front of her, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle in his wagon. "Lots of people pass through here," Thomas said carefully. "What's your business with this woman?" The stranger smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "She's my niece. Her family is very worried about her. They sent me to bring her home safely." "I'm sorry," Thomas said, "but I haven't seen anyone matching that description. You might try asking at the general store. They see more travelers than most." The stranger's gaze flicked to Isabella, who kept her head down, her face partially hidden by her bonnet. "Perhaps your wife has seen her," Women often notice other women. My wife is from back east, Thomas said smoothly. She's only been in town today for our wedding. The stranger studied them for a moment longer, then tipped his hat. Well, congratulations on your marriage. I hope you'll be very happy together. As he walked away, Thomas and Isabella quickly finished loading their wagon. They didn't speak until they were well outside of town, climbing the familiar path toward Cedar Ridge. He was one of them, Isabella said quietly. I recognized the accent, the way he moved. They found me. Thomas's jaw tightened. He doesn't know for sure. If he did, he wouldn't have approached us so openly. What do we do? Isabella asked. Thomas reached over and took her hand. We go home, he said. We prepare, and we protect what's ours. As they rode through the darkness toward their cabin, both of them knew that their peaceful interlude was over. The real test of their marriage was about to begin. The man in the dark coat watched the wagon disappear into the mountain darkness, then walked to the hotel where two other men waited in the shadows. His name was Vincent Torino, and he had been hunting Isabella Rossetti for 6 months, across 3 states. That was her, he told his companions. The height, the way she moved, even with her face hidden. I'd know those eyes anywhere. What's the plan? Asked Carlo, a thin man with cold eyes who served as Torino's enforcer. We wait until morning, then follow their trail. The locals said he lives up on Cedar Ridge. Isolated, perfect for our purposes. Torino lit a cigarette, his expression calculating. But we need to be careful. That lumberman looked like he could handle himself. Meanwhile, Thomas and Isabella reached their cabin. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the mountains, Thomas immediately began checking their loading weapons, and taking inventory of their supplies. How long do you think we have? Isabella asked, helping him move furniture away from the windows. Not long, Thomas replied grimly. They'll want to move quickly before we can get word to anyone or escape further into the mountain. Isabella nodded, her face pale but determined. What do you need me to do? Thomas paused in his preparations to look at his wife. He reminded himself with fierce pride. My father taught me, Isabella said. I'm not an expert, but I can hit what I aim at. Thomas handed her his hunting rifle. This has better range than my pistol. Take position upstairs in the bedroom. If they get past me, you'll have a clear shot at anyone coming up the stairs. Isabella took the rifle, her hands steady, despite the fear in her eyes. Thomas, if something happens to me, nothing is going to happen to you. Thomas interrupted, cupping her face in his hands. I didn't find you just to lose you now. We're going to get through this together. They spent the morning fortifying the cabin, creating barriers and escape routes. Thomas's years in the logging camps had taught him about dangerous situations, and his natural intelligence helped him think strategically about their defense. Around noon, they heard the first sound sources approaching through the forest, trying to move quietly but unable to mask their presence completely from Thomas's experienced ears. They're here, Thomas whispered, taking his position by the main window. Isabella crept upstairs, her heart pounding as she settled into position. From her vantage point, she could see movement in the tree line, at least 3 men, possibly more. Thomas, Blackwood. Torino's voice echoed across the clearing. We know you're in there. We don't want any trouble with you. Just send out the woman, and we'll be on our way. Thomas's response was to fire a warning shot that splintered a tree branch inches from Torino's head. She stays with me. You don't understand, Torino called back. She's a dangerous criminal. She's wanted by the authorities. Then let the authorities come for her, Thomas shouted. Not hired killers hiding in my woods. The standoff stretched for several tense minutes. Then Isabella heard the sound she'd been dreading, movement on the cabin's roof. They were trying to get in from above. Thomas, she called down. Someone's on the roof. Thomas cursed, realizing they were dealing with professionals who understood tactics. Stay where you are. Cover the stairs. A section of the roof exploded inward as one of Torino's men broke through the wooden shingles. Isabella fired instinctively, the bullet catching the intruder in the shoulder and sending him tumbling back through the hole. The gunshot was the signal for a full assault. Windows shattered as bullets flew into the cabin. Thomas returned fire methodically, his years of hunting making him deadly accurate. 2 of Torino's men fell in the first exchange. Enough. Torino's voice was filled with rage. Burn it. Burn them out. Isabella watched in horror as one of the remaining men began splashing kerosene around the cabin's exterior walls. The smell of the accelerant reached her nostrils, and she knew they had only minutes before the cabin became a death trap. Thomas, she screamed. They're going to burn us out. Thomas made a split-second decision. He couldn't let Isabella die in the flames, and he couldn't let Torino take her back to a life of imprisonment and abuse. There was only one option left. "Isabella," he called. "When I say run, you go out the back window and head for the forest. There's a cave about a mile north. You remember the one I showed you? I'm not leaving you." Isabella protested. "You have to," Thomas replied. "I'm going to give you a chance to escape. If I don't make it, you keep running. You find a new life somewhere they can't follow." "Thomas." "No," Isabella cried, but she could already see the flames beginning to lick at the walls. Thomas took a deep breath, said a prayer, and threw open the front door. "You want her?" he roared, charging into the clearing with his rifle blazing. "You'll have to go through me." His sudden assault caught Torino's remaining men off guard. Thomas's rifle took down another attacker before the man could react, and his massive frame crashed into a second man, sending them both tumbling to the ground. From upstairs, Isabella watched her husband fighting for their lives with a courage that took her breath away. She knew what she had to do. Instead of running, Isabella Rossetti, Blackwood raised her rifle and took careful aim at Vincent. "This ends now," she whispered, and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed across the mountain, and Torino spun around, clutching his chest. His eyes met Isabella's through the window, and for a moment, there was recognition, and something that might have been respect. "You always were too stubborn, for your own good," he gasped, then collapsed. The remaining attackers, seeing their leader fall, lost their nerve, and fled into the forest. Thomas stood in the clearing, breathing hard, his clothes torn and bloodied but alive. Isabella ran down the stairs and threw herself into his arms. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," Thomas said, holding her tightly. "Are you?" "I'm fine," Isabella whispered against his chest. "It's over. It's finally over." As they held each other in the smoky clearing, watching the flames consume part of their roof, both of them knew that they had crossed a line. They had fought for their love and won, but the victory had come at a cost that would change them forever. The flames had died down to smoldering embers by the time Sheriff Morrison arrived with a posse of townsmen. Word had spread quickly through Millbrook Falls about the gunfire on Cedar Ridge, and the sheriff had organized a rescue party, expecting to find tragedy. Instead, he found Thomas and Isabella sitting on their porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. The cabin was damaged but still standing, and 3 bodies lay in the clearing, testament to a battle that had ended in victory for the defenders. "Thomas," Sheriff Morrison said, dismounting from his horse, "are you folks all right?" "We're fine," Sheriff Thomas replied, rising to greet the lawman. "Just some unwanted visitors who wouldn't take no for an answer." Sheriff Morrison surveyed the scene: the bullet holes in the cabin walls, the burned section of roof, the bodies of the attackers. "Looks like quite a fight. What happened here?" Isabella stood beside her husband, her hand in his. "They came for me," she said simply. "Men from my past. They wanted to take me back to a life I'd escaped from." "And you fought them off?" the sheriff asked, his tone respectful rather than questioning. "We defended our home," Thomas said firmly. "Our marriage. Our right to live in peace." Sheriff Morrison nodded, understanding the unspoken message. In frontier justice, a man had the right to defend his wife and property. "Well, it looks like you handled the situation. I'll need to ask a few questions for my report, but I don't see any crime here except the ones committed by these strangers." As the sheriff and his men dealt with the aftermath, Thomas and Isabella began the work of rebuilding. The damaged section of roof would need to be replaced, the windows repaired, and the bullet holes patched. But the cabin's foundation was solid, just like their marriage. "Are you sorry?" Isabella asked that evening as they sat by the fire, sharing a quiet meal. "Sorry that you married me, knowing what it would bring." Thomas looked at his wife, really looked at her. The fear that had haunted her eyes for months was gone, replaced by something stronger. She had faced her demons and won. They had faced them together, and won. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," he said. "Marrying you was the best decision I ever made." Isabella smiled, the expression transforming her face. "Even though I brought killers to your door." "Even though," Thomas confirmed. "Isabella, what we went through to death, that wasn't just about defending our property. That was about defending our right to love each other, our right to build a life together. No one can take that away from us now." Over the following weeks, as they repaired the cabin and returned to their routine, both Thomas and Isabella felt a change in their relationship. The crisis had tested their bond and proven it unbreakable. They had literally fought for their love and won. "I want to tell you something," Isabella said one evening as they worked together to install new window glass. "Something I've never told anyone." Thomas paused in his work, giving her his full attention. "My real name, birth name isn't. It's Isabella Marie Conti. Rossetti was my mother's maiden name. The name my father chose when we fled Italy. Thomas nodded, understanding the significance of her trust. Why are you telling me now? Because I want you to know all of me, Isabella said. Every part of my past, my real identity. I don't want any secrets between us. Isabella Marie Conti Blackwood, Thomas said, trying out the full name. It's beautiful. All of it. Isabella smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. I love you, Thomas Blackwood. Not just for saving me, but for seeing me. For loving the woman I really am. Not just the woman I was trying to be. I love you too, Isabella Marie, Thomas replied, pulling her into his arms. All of you, every part of your story, every chapter of your life. It all led you to me. As autumn returned to the mountains, Thomas and Isabella settled into their new life as husband and wife. The cabin, rebuilt and strengthened, felt more like home than ever. They had faced the worst of Isabella's past and emerged victorious. Their love tested by fire and proven true. What do you think comes next? Isabella asked one evening as they sat on their repaired porch, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. Thomas considered the question. I think we live, he said simply. We build the life we want, raise the family we dream of, and grow old together on this mountain. We've earned our peace, Isabella. Now we get to enjoy it. Isabella leaned against her husband's shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him, the unwavering love that had transformed her from a frightened refugee into a woman who could face any challenge. I like the sound of that, she said. In the distance, a wolf howled, not a threat, but a song of wildness and freedom. Thomas and Isabella listened together, no longer afraid of the darkness, no longer running from the past. They had found their place in the world, and they were home. 5 years had passed since the siege on Cedar Ridge, and the cabin that had once sheltered 2 wounded souls now rang with the laughter of children. Thomas and Isabella had built more than just a marriage. They had created a legacy of love that would endure for generations. Papa, Mama, look what we found. 8-year-old Maria Blackwood came running up the path, her dark hair flying, her green eyes bright with excitement. She carried a bird's nest in her small hands, her younger brother Antonio close behind her. Careful, sweetheart, Isabella called, watching her daughter with a mixture of pride and gentle concern. Remember what we talked about, the baby birds need to stay with their mother. Thomas looked up from the fence he was repairing, his weathered face creasing into a smile. At 37, he was still strong and capable, but there was a contentment in his eyes that hadn't been there in his bachelor days. Show me what you found, little one. Maria held up the nest, explaining in the mixture of English and Italian that Isabella had taught her. It fell from the big oak tree. Papa, the babies are so small, we should put it back, Antonio added. He was 6, with his father's brown eyes and his mother's quick intelligence, so the mama bird can find them. Isabella joined them, wiping her hands on her apron. She was pregnant again, her belly round with their 3rd child, due in the spring. The years had softened her angular beauty, filling out her frame and adding laugh lines to her eyes. But she had never been more beautiful to Thomas. That's very thoughtful of you both, Isabella said, ruffling Antonio's hair. Your father can help you put it back in the tree. As Thomas lifted his son onto his shoulders to reach the oak's lower branches, Isabella watched with a heart full of gratitude. The frightened woman who had worn a burlap sack over her head seemed like someone from another lifetime. This was who she had always been meant to be, a mother, a wife, a woman who belonged somewhere. Careful, Maria called, dancing around the base of the tree. Don't let Antonio fall. I won't let him fall, Thomas promised, securing the nest in a safe fork of the tree. Just like I'll never let any of you fall. That evening, after the children were asleep, Thomas and Isabella sat on their porch as they had countless times before. The new porch swing that Thomas had built creaked gently as they rocked, Isabella's head on his shoulder. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't been at the auction that day? Isabella asked. Thomas considered the question. Sometimes, he admitted, but then I remember that I was supposed to be there. Everything in my life led me to that moment, the loneliness, the isolation, even the pain. It all had a purpose. I used to think I was cursed, Isabella said quietly, that everywhere I went, I brought danger and sorrow. But you showed me that sometimes what looks like a curse is really a blessing in disguise. You brought me life, Thomas said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. You brought me love, laughter, purpose. You gave me children who carry the best parts of both of us. How could that be anything but a blessing? Isabella smiled, feeling the baby kick inside her. I hope this one has your patience, she said. Maria has enough of my stubbornness for the whole family. Thomas chuckled. She's going to be a force to be reckoned with, just like her mother. And Antonio is going to be a protector, just like his father, Isabella added. Did you see how he wanted to take care of those baby birds? They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of the forest owls calling, leaves rustling, the eternal whisper of the wind through the pines. Thomas, Isabella said suddenly, I want to tell you something. What is it? Isabella sat up to look at him, her face serious. I've been thinking about what to name the baby. If it's a boy, I want to name him Vincent, Isabella said quietly. Thomas's eyebrows rose in surprise. After ... After the man who hunted me, Isabella confirmed. I know it sounds strange, but I've been thinking about it a lot. If Vincent Torino hadn't found me, I might have spent the rest of my life running. I might never have fought for what I wanted. In a way, he forced me to choose, so decide what was worth fighting for. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, processing her words. You want to name our son after the man who tried to kill us? I want to name our son after the moment we chose to fight for our love, Isabella corrected. The moment we decided that what we had was worth any price. Vincent Torino gave us that gift, even if he didn't mean to. Thomas smiled, understanding dawning in his eyes. Vincent Blackwood, he said, testing the name. I like it. It has strength. And if it's a girl, what about hope? Thomas suggested. Because that's what you gave me. Hope for a future I thought I'd never have. Isabella leaned over and kissed him, tasting the salt of happy tears on her lips. Hope Blackwood, she said. As they prepared to go inside, Isabella paused at the door and looked back at the mountains that had sheltered them, the forest that had hidden them, the clearing where they had fought for their right to love each other. Thank you, she whispered to the night air, to the universe that had brought them together in the most unlikely way. Thomas heard her and understood. Thank you, he echoed, wrapping his arms around his wife and unborn child. Inside the cabin, Maria and Antonio slept peacefully in their beds, dreaming of birds and trees and the endless love of parents who had fought for the right to give them life. The wooden ring that Thomas had carved for Isabella still sat on her finger, worn smooth by years of wear but no less precious for its simplicity. On the mantelpiece, next to their marriage certificate and a photograph taken in town the previous year, sat a small wooden box. Inside was a faded burlap sack, the one Isabella had worn at the auction, the symbol of her old life. She kept it not as a reminder of pain, but as a testament to transformation. It was proof that sometimes the darkest moments of our lives are simply the beginning of our greatest love stories. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow. And in the cabin, on Cedar Ridge, 5 souls slept peacefully, surrounded by the kind of love that conquers all obstacles, endures all hardships, and transforms even the loneliest hearts into something beautiful. Thomas Blackwood had paid $20 for a woman with a sack over her head. In return, he had received a love that would last for eternity, a family that would carry his name and values into the future, and the unshakable knowledge that sometimes the best things in life come disguised as the worst. Isabella Marie Conti Blackwood had lost everything: her father, her homeland, her freedom, even her name. But in losing it all, she had found something infinitely more valuable, a place where she belonged, a man who loved her completely, and the courage to fight for the life she deserved. Their love story had begun with the sound of an auctioneer's gavel, but it would continue in the laughter of their children, the strength of their marriage, and the legacy of love they would leave behind. For in the end, it wasn't the price Thomas paid that mattered, it was the value of what he received. And that, like all true love, was priceless. In the spring of 1892, Isabella gave birth to Hope Blackwood, a daughter with her father's gentle nature and her mother's fierce determination. The Blackwood family continued to grow and thrive on Cedar Ridge, their love story becoming legend in the small town of Millbrook Falls. Thomas and Isabella lived to see their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren, all of whom carried within them the unbreakable bond forged between a lonely lumberjack and a woman who had learned to speak her name with pride. The cabin still stands today, a testament to the power of love to transform even the darkest circumstances into something beautiful. And sometimes, on quiet mountain evenings, visitors claim they can still hear the gentle sound of laughter carried on the wind, the eternal echo of a love that conquered all.